was certainly a very interesting start to the meeting. For those of you that are watching this recording, DM me if you want to know what happened. It was quite interesting. But no, thank you all very much for being here, for being very patient with us as we figure this out. This is our first time doing one of these events, and we take the agile process with everything that we do in life. Everything is a learning experience. My name is Zach Gardner. I know most of you looking at the attendee list. I'm the chief architect here at Keyhole Software. And this particular presentation of mine is a culmination of about 6 to 7 months of research that I did on generative AI. We've done a lot of, soul searching after crypto. We tried to do blockchain for a little bit. We were really excited about it. And then crypto winter happened. And there's a fair amount of scar tissue that's developed, I think, with a lot of people of not embracing something just because it's the hype, just because it's something that people are into. We really need to find quality use cases for it. And so my job as chief architect is to go out, to look at things, to really figure out what it is that the industry is going to be talking about. What are the use cases that are, viable and legitimate? And then figure out how do we incorporate those into our software development lifecycle. So in case you didn't know, Keyhole Software, we're based here in Lenexa, Kansas, as you can tell from the sunflower. The best way to describe what we do, I see actually a few people that work at Keyhole, so hopefully most of you know what we do. When companies want to capitalize on an additional revenue stream, if they want to get to a new client base, if they have an idea for how they can expand their business, but they can't find something off the shelf that allows them to capitalize on that, that's where we fit in. We work in banking and healthcare and finance. We have a project in the Amazon rainforest. It really spans the gambit of anything that you can use custom software for. We only have senior developers on staff. We did have an internship program for a little while, but our focus really is in US-based senior software developers. Our average tenure is 4.5 to 5 years. Average number of experience is 17, and our acceptance rates of candidates is probably akin to a Ivy League institution. We're very picky about the people that we bring on because we want to maintain high quality. So to get things started off, I've told you a little bit about me. Let's try this. This is something new I'm trying, so bear with me. I have 3 questions for everyone on the phone, and then a bonus question, because you always got to have a bonus. And when I ask the questions, if it applies to you or you want to vote yes, use the little raise your hand icon. So, first question. Raise your hand if you are an individual contributor. If you're someone that is writing software on a daily basis, you have tickets that you're responsible for, you're the one that essentially produces code for your organization. So good. We got about 4 people. And then raise your hand. So you can take your hand down, I think. Oh, this is so neat to see it updated in real time. Raise your hand if you are a manager or a director, if you have to worry about individual contributors that are the ones that are producing software, are the ones that are, if you have to worry about people, essentially. So good. So we got a few raised hands. Raise your hand if, even with all the layoffs and everything that's been happening in our field, raise your hand if it's still hard to find really good software developers. People that are, very high quality, people that you like to work with. See, a lot of people raise their hands. Apologies, because if you're based in Kansas City, probably one of the reasons you're experiencing that is because we keep the really good software developers. So just a little gag, little game I like to play with everyone. But no, raise your hand. All right, last question. I guarantee this. Raise your hand if you are an expert in large language models and generative AI. If you are someone that could theoretically apply to the mythical $900,000 a year job at Netflix. Good. I don't raise my hand either because I'm new to this too. I'm still trying to figure it out. My background, my experience is all in how do I develop software applications at scale? How do I take someone's idea and turn that into working software? So I would never pitch myself as a machine learning expert, nor is this presentation a sales pitch in disguise. There's no product that we're trying to sell out of this. There's no service that we're offering. Like, this is egalitarian information where we have gone out, we have done a number of different research, a lot of different studies, and we're just trying to let the world know, barring the people that like to join meetings and, have a little gag at us. So, we can all kind of lower our defense shields. Like this is a welcoming environment. If you have questions at any time, pop them in the Q&A. I have it up in my other monitor. And let's begin. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a few things. First, we have to go through what we're actually talking about when we talk about, generative pre-trained transformers as well as large language models. And I've seen this done a number of different times. I want to, in as much as I can, not be boring about it, because this can be kind of a dry topic. Then we're going to move into some really interesting stories that I've found of where people are using this, but they've run into a little bit of issues. And that's not to say that it's a bad technology. This is just something that we all need to be concerned about. We all kind of need to know what we're getting into. Then I want to focus on some really good use cases, some scenarios that I've found where people have actually used this to further their company, to further them personally. And then sort of the piece de resistance, the how do we add it to our software development lifecycle, and then wrapping it all up. So to begin with, when we talk about generative AI, it's a very specific subset of the discipline of artificial intelligence. We're not talking about something that is necessarily a classification algorithm where you show it a picture of a dog and then it's like a dog, and you show it a picture of a cat and it's a cat. We're not doing facial recognition. It's all about generating something. The field of artificial intelligence has gone through a number of different sort of revolutions over the years. The generative one being the one that we're currently in, where you have some input and then it gets passed through a transformer, either like an encoder or a decoder or an encoder-decoder, and then it produces something. You could have it produce or generate, to keep with the same parlance, text. You could have it generate images. You could have it generate videos. You could have it generate audio. You can have it generate, whatever you want. But it's all about some input going into some large language model that's been semi-supervised trained on a huge amount of data and then generating something out of it. So, elephant in the room. Generative AI is different than what we would refer to as artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence is what you think of when you think of Skynet, a computer program that constantly learns from itself. It's growing and expanding. It potentially has consciousness as well. Some debate on if this is, possible. I know there was a lot of news articles that came out about Q-Star being the reason why Sam Altman left OpenAI. I mean, there's some debate over that. But needless to say, we're not talking about this thing that is constantly learning and constantly evolving. We're really talking about large language models, which are trained and then deployed. And if you've ever had a conversation with ChatGPT, you know what I'm talking about. It's kind of like talking to a toddler, where you could have a conversation with them. You can get some really good information, but as soon as that conversation ends, just like a toddler's brain, it's just like that conversation gets lost into the ether, and they're not constantly learning from these experiences. The learning only happens in the training phase. So when we talk about large language models, when we talk about GPTs, that's really what we're talking about. The ability to take some input, transform it, produce some output, and that transformation is run through an algorithm that has billions, tens of billions of parameters that was trained on a vast number of information. So anything I will say anything that those generative pre-transformers can do, a human can do as well. It's important to remember that. We think that these computers are, masters of computation and complexity. What they're doing is doing the same thing a human can do at scale. If I spent long enough, could have created my own image like this if I was talented in Photoshop, if I grabbed some bars and then did a little chip, I could have generated this on my own. So what it's producing is not necessarily a novel artifact. It's not something that is completely new to the universe. What it is doing is it allows people to interface with these technologies at scale. And it's not a new problem, it's just a very prolific problem. So, to start off our spooky stories, I want to show you a funny clip that I found that illustrates how generative AI could be used in scenarios where not necessarily fraud, but definitely deception.
I emailed SpaceX a meme I made of Elon Musk that says we can use the rocks on Mars to feed starving people. And I signed my name as Jackie Jones with a newspaper I made up called the Coloradoan Times. And they wrote back and said they're not familiar with the Coloradoan Times, and they asked for the source of the graphic in the quote. So I said, we're a newspaper based out of Colorado that covers hard-hitting topics and groundbreaking stories. The source of the quote is Elon Musk. Thank you for confirmation. They're like, asking you for the source is no way confirming the legitimacy of it. And they said, can you provide more information? And they said, the Coloradoan Times is not found on the internet, and no one there is familiar with it. So I wrote back and said, apologies, since the meme said Elon Musk, I thought it was implied that the quote was from Elon Musk. I didn't hear anything from you stating it was not from Elon Musk, so the meme gained further authenticity with your reply. And I'd like to point out that at one time, no one had ever heard of SpaceX either. However, it's now a multi-billion-dollar company with a mission to feed people Mars rocks. They wrote back, and they shared a link. They said it's not Elon Musk that said that. They shared a link to their mission statement on their website, which has a quote from him saying he can't think of anything more exciting than going out there and being among the stars. So I said, that's strange. You said it's not an actual quote from Elon, because when I click the link you sent me, I get this. We can use the rocks on Mars to feed starving people.
So this video, funny as it may seem, illustrates a very salient point. People, just like we found out from this meeting, they like to mess with other people. And the comedian's ability to doctor some images, come up with a fake email. He has his great YouTube channel, by the way. Tons of funny stuff on there. It always took time to be able to do it. And what generative AI allowed us to do is to be able to do this at scale. So things like deep fakes, being able to recreate someone's voice. These are all things that are potential outcomes that anyone that is implementing a generative AI system really needs to take into account. This was probably the funniest one, what I just showed you that I found of, an example where generative AI could go wrong. One of the earliest examples that I actually remember was, I believe this is in March or April, sometime around there. News came out that Samsung has banned all of its employees from using ChatGPT because some employees were taking information that it was, proprietary and internal, copying and pasting it into ChatGPT and asking it to summarize it. Well, that's a cloud vendor system. The data security of that particular system, not really meant for confidential information, unfortunately. So they somehow it was due to like a bug in Redis, the chats got leaked, and then all of a sudden Samsung intellectual property is out there in the wild. So they took a very hard line stance and they said, no, you will not pass go, will collect $200, you're not going to use this stuff. Another one that I ran into recently was a law firm in Florida submitted it was part of their documentation for some eviction case that they were working on. They submitted a brief to the judge, and it had examples of prior court cases that showed that based on previous rulings, it's a legal term known as stare decisis, that says, this is how people have ruled in the past, and this is why you should rule on us now. Well, the judge went through that court case and found that the court cases referenced in this brief did not exist in any way, shape, or form. So then they started asking the attorney that put this together, how'd you find out about these court cases? And the attorney had to fess up. And the attorney was like, well, I was really busy and I might have used ChatGPT to come up with the ability to, do this. And so they were like, all right, no, not cool. You cannot do this. He was fined a few $1,000s, which, to an attorney, especially an eviction attorney, might not be crazy. But it illustrates one of the implications of using this particular tool. LLMs and GPTs can do what's called hallucinate, where if you ask it, what is the name of the second elephant that has walked on the moon? It'll say something like, that's Steve Jr. His father, Steve Sr., was actually the first one. It'll just kind of come up with stuff. And it's not that it's doing it maliciously. It's just that probabilistically, it's giving you an answer that it thinks that you want, which is okay as long as you have a human sitting there to be able to filter the results. You don't just want to copy pasta directly what you're getting. And that's what Sports Illustrated ran into. They got called out because they had a few articles that people were like, what? Who are these authors? And so they Googled them and they found out that Sports Illustrated was producing articles from authors that did not exist. They're not real people. You can't do that. It's okay. It's more okay if you say, hey, this is something that is being produced by a GPT, but you can't attribute it to an actual human. Samsung, you'll recall, had issues with their intellectual property, going into ChatGPT. Apple saw that and they just completely banned the use of Copilot, because the way that tools like Copilot work, you have to give it an existing code base and then it says, all right, this function, I want to add this functionality to it. Let's make sure that Apple was like, let's make sure that we're not going to have our intellectual property exposed because it has to have the source code to be able to generate additional code. They just said, no, we're not going to do it at all. Which then leads to one of the more interesting, spooky stories that happened. I believe I was talking to someone about this yesterday over Thanksgiving, where the board of OpenAI released Sam Altman as CEO. He was on the market for a day. I remember he was going to have his new startup with a few people that left with him. A letter came out, and then Satya brought him on to Microsoft and had this, amazing Monday morning tweet that everyone was like, oh man, look at Microsoft. Like they totally, know what they're doing. And then this open letter came out from all these employees. And then the next day he is all of a sudden back as CEO of OpenAI. Now, it's spooky in that when that happened, everyone got to realize how dependent we are on this one company for all of our generative AI needs. Now, granted, there are a lot of other people out there that are doing this work, but this is like a seminal company. This is like what would happen if, I don't even know if there's a great analogy, if Walmart went dark and just was like, no, we're not going to open today. Think of how big of a disruption that would be. Very similar to what happened on AI. So although we might have other options out there, it's interesting to see they are somewhat like Bitcoin, where the rest of the market tends to follow. And so there were some things that I couldn't share explicitly, but this is kind of a summary of what I found for other bad use cases. The one that I kind of want to draw your attention to is if you're going to be using a large language model, specifically GitHub Copilot, to produce production code, that third bullet, the second one on the first one on the top right, there was a study done that I found at Columbia where they used GitHub Copilot to produce 500 code samples across a variety of use cases, across many different languages, And what they found was that of those it might have been 600 samples, 30% of them contained very, very obvious, very well known, very well documented security vulnerabilities on them. So you're thinking about it, if a developer, especially a junior developer, is asking GitHub Copilot for some code, it produces something, and then they're immediately doing a Git check-in without understanding what are the performance concerns, what are the security concerns around this code, you're really opening yourself up for issues in production, especially with data exfiltration. Like, you don't want to be in the news for having GitHub Copilot produce you code that you just blindly use. There are some ways around that, and I'll kind of talk through them later, but all is not lost. You know, when we talk about these spooky stories, it's important to remember that large language models and GPTs, they are a tool, just like any other tool that we have in our tool belt. And as long as you know how to use them effectively, if you understand how to use them correctly, then you can be effective with it. But don't trust it just because it's a new tool, which then leads us into the happier parts of the presentation. Good use cases that I have found. One of the more relevant ones for me was during a Falcons and Panthers game. Or no, Carolina? Yeah. What the NFL did was they had a video-to-video large language model that was able to take information, like the information on the top from real time from the game, and run it through a large language model with the prompt of, I want to make this look like Toy Story. And it looks, fairly real time, fairly crisp, fairly accurate. But remember, this is the NFL. They have a pretty deep set of checkbooks that they can use to write checks for when this was going on. This is not something that a regular company off the street can even get close to affording. The operational costs, the training costs are very, very high, somewhat prohibitively expensive. So just because you see it done doesn't mean, you should do it. But especially when video to video. Audio to audio, text to text, those are a little bit cheaper. And one of the companies actually here in Kansas City that was recently published in the Business Journal, actually yesterday, I believe I had to add this slide yesterday, was SelectQuote. They are using generative AI to be able to help supplement, to be able to help complement, but not replace a lot of their agents. They can spend so much less time talking to people if they're able to use generative AI to help guide a customer through a series of prompts, somewhat free form, that then feed the information to the rep on the SelectQuote side with all the information that they need. And I think they were able to eliminate like 5 or 6 or 7 minutes per call for what the agent actually had to manually do themselves. So they're not planning on completely replacing these agents. What they're using generative AI for is to help complement them and be able to give the customer a more tailored experience. So it's very, very much a win-win. Another great example is Duolingo. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to learn a new language, but especially when you're old like me, it can be a little tough. And it's much more effective if you have someone that can sit there with you and correct your pronunciation as you go along. To do that, though, you need to find someone that is willing to work with your schedule, that you have to pay, and it's effective, but it's not very accessible. What Duolingo did is they have an audio to audio large language model that will listen to you saying certain phrases, certain words, certain conjugations of verbs, and be able to produce for you recommendations on slowing down in certain parts, speeding up in certain parts, fixing intonation. Very subtle things that it would be really hard to get otherwise. Now, one of the other examples that we always have to bring up is Microsoft Copilot. And I was talking to someone about this, I think yesterday. We've seen somewhat mixed results in our usage of GitHub Copilot. It is integrated very deeply, very much as a first-class tool with a lot of things that Microsoft is doing, given that they are essentially the backbone for OpenAPI. And OpenAI probably pays them about $1 million a day in terms of operational costs, which is just nuts to think about. But, that's the scale that they run at. Microsoft Copilot is really good at very simple things that honestly people are probably okay doing by themselves. We're not seeing a lot of very novel use cases where it does something overly complex. You ask it to do something complex and it'll be like, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do that. But that's okay. That's totally fine. The technology isn't quite there yet. Now, if I remember right, Goldman does use GitHub Copilot, which is a tool that lets you generate code from code using, descriptions and prompts. So it's kind of interesting that there is a firm on Wall Street that is even using this technology to help make their engineers more effective. They were the only one that I could actually find on Wall Street that was open about their usage of it. Morgan Stanley is using generative AI, but they're really only using it in a document summary fashion. Now, one of the big ones, Walmart, one of the biggest employers in the entire world, they're using generative AI in a number of different ways. The first one is very much similar to what Morgan Stanley is doing, where they have it trained on their large set of documents, and people in their corporate office in Arkansas are able to go and ask it to summarize documents that would take just a long time for a human to summarize themselves. They're also using it to negotiate with suppliers. So, Walmart is very, very famous for being able to get their suppliers to get their prices down as low as they possibly can. What they're using it for, generative AI specifically, is to be able to negotiate with suppliers via a chatbot. So the chatbot will actually be the one that says, oh, your prices are too high. Let's see if we can get you down, 6 or 7 or 8%. So they go down 6 or 7, 7.5%. And at the very last moment, a human comes in and says, well, you've already gone down 7.5%. Like, could you go down to maybe 8.75%? So they're able to take all those savings from what the chatbot did, have the human come in at the very end, get them just a little bit lower, and pass those savings on to the consumer, which is a really, really novel use case that when I tell people, their mind is just like blown. But like, that's a very, very appropriate, very salient use case for generative AI. And if you didn't see your company mentioned here, don't worry. This is from a Gartner study that I found where a lot of companies, when they asked them, how many of you are actually using this technology, 70% are exploring it in some form or fashion. So there's more than likely, if you work at a large company, pockets of your company that are thinking about using this and trying to find it in the right scenario. Only 4% of the 2,500 companies that they surveyed said they're actually using this technology in production. These three numbers, I wouldn't focus on that so much. I would focus on these 17 and these 10%, 70 and 10%, excuse me. If your competitors are in this exploring phase and your company is in this none of the above phase, eventually your competitors are probably going to be in this production bucket. And if they're using a tool that makes them more effective, that gives them a competitive edge, you might want to explore adding it to your company's offerings, which then leads me into how do we add this to the software development lifecycle? We have to go kind of slow on this. I'm going to take you kind of on a journey because we have to have a very well-rounded view of how we add this to our software development lifecycle before we actually do it. The first thing, and this is homework that I give you all, is to read a study produced by the Boston Consulting Group and Harvard Business Review on how they found in the workplace, not just companies, but people like you and I and everyone on this list, how we are actually using generative AI today. And they found that there are two camps of people. One of them are the centaurs and the other are the cyborgs. Centaurs are people that are using this to complement things that they're not great at, but they're still taking control of most of their workday. Cyborgs, on the other hand, are trying to do everything that they can with it. They're using it to automate whatever it is that they find. People usually fit into one of those two extremes. The article then goes on to talk about their recommendations for how people use this. Generative AI is very good at certain things. It is able to take a large amount of text and be able to very quickly summarize it faster than a human could ever possibly hope for. But humans are good at some very, very important things, some of which are emotional intelligence and ethics, to where generative AI can give you stuff, but you do need a human to be the arbiter, to really be the decision maker. Just like with automated cars, which I saw Tesla actually had a recall on their automated driving, you still need a human in the pilot seat. But the question then comes up, what happens if you have a ChatGPT that produces something, a human says, all right, that looks good, and then you get sued for what you did? Maybe it was a breach of copyright, maybe it was plagiarism, what have you. There's a lot of debate in terms of, is what large language models produce covered by copyright, or could it be also covered under parody law? I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be a lawyer, even on TV. What I will say is there are more and more companies that are coming out with these indemnification clauses, which, as far as I understand it, means that they are taking the responsibility of, if we produce something through a generative AI tool and you use it, you can't be sued because we were the ones that produced it. Now, if you're taking some text and altering it, you could be sued, but at its core, you are not liable for it. It is they are taking the liability onto their hands, which then should make you think, well, shoot, I wonder if people at my company are using this technology today. And do we have any policies around how people should be using it, how people shouldn't be using it? At Keyhole, we actually used ChatGPT to be able to recommend what pieces of our generative AI policy should look like. And this is the first recommendation that I have for you all. And if you want to incorporate generative AI tooling into your software development lifecycle, or even into your company's core offerings as a whole, you really need to think about, from a policy standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, and a legal standpoint, what are some of the guardrails that you want to put in with allowing the best parts of these tools to still be very prolific and encourage innovation in your company, yet do it responsibly and do it safely. So these are just some highlights. We want to make sure that if our developers do choose to use it, that they say this is, they still have to have the final word. And it's a really good tool to be able to get some vague guidelines on what you should be working on, but you still have to be the one that is making sure you're not uploading confidential information, that you're not infringing upon anyone's rights, and that you're not violating any licensing or anything like that. You have to understand how this tool is used. Second recommendation that I have, this field is constantly changing. I literally have to update these slides once a day. Something changes, something happens, and the way that I find out about it best is through newsletters. Alpha Signal is probably the best newsletter that I have found for making sure that I personally am staying up to date. So now we have a regulation, we have policies within our company, we're staying up to date. Now, this is where your company's legal comes in, because they should be monitoring developments like President Biden's executive order the day before Halloween on how do we use generative AI to enhance our lives, and how do we mitigate the bad or the inimical aspects of it. It's a very long executive order. If you suffer from insomnia, I highly encourage you to read it because it will put you to sleep within a few minutes. But what I was able to get out of it after I had a sufficient amount of caffeine in my bloodstream, if you are a company that wants to use generative AI to be able to make money off of it, you have to make sure that you're doing safety tests against whatever your core product is, and you need to share that with the federal government to prove that you are taking sufficient safeguards so that customers and the general public is not harmed. Very similar in terms of necessary regulations in terms of banking and finance to know your customer. Like, this is just common sense. We have to do it. It's a regulation, sure, but it just makes sense. You have to make sure that Americans are not exposed to any AI-enabled fraud. And this is where the YouTube video that I showed came in. What if we had a large language model that was able to produce Elon Musk style speech? Could he call into a radio show and say, oh, Tesla's going bankrupt, sell all your shares? Maybe they might be able to do that. How do you prevent against that? I don't have the answer, but I know this is something that the federal government is thinking about. And the last bullet point is probably the best summarization of this executive order. You need to make sure that you're mitigating harms while still allowing people to reap the benefits of this amazing technology. It's not cognitive dissonance. This is something that we have to keep in our heads at the same time. How do we balance the two? The executive order was the first one that I came across. A few weeks ago, CISA and the British equivalent of CISA, the NCSC, I don't recall what that stands for, came out with a policy statement, guidelines on if you're going to be developing AI systems, how do you do so securely? OWASP, I believe this was actually yesterday, or maybe this was Monday, also came out with a checklist. They're probably most famous for their OWASP top 10 security vulnerabilities for web application development, as well as, software in general. They came out with a security and governance checklist that you want to read. Now, if you're overwhelmed because you haven't seen these before and you're wondering what else you're missing, I'm in the same boat because it's really hard to keep track of all of these things. Other than Alpha Signal, the other thing that I rely upon is the State of AI report. This was published in October, so already it's out of date. But if you're curious to read it, if you go to stateof.ai, there's 200 slides, 300 slides, something in there. It is a massive presentation that gives you a very, very comprehensive overview of where they see our field going, what are all the developments that have happened in terms of AI, really focusing on generative AI. That's kind of the theme of 2023. Where do they see this going in the next few years? And they have a ton of just summarizations, some ton of recommendations. And out of that, I have to interject. I have to do a little interlude. Because what I got out of the report was there are some really good ways to use large language models, and then there are some ways that they don't come out and say it, but after reading all those slides, that last bullet point, that's the one that should scare entrepreneurs. I'm not saying this to be scary. I'm saying this because I care, and I don't want to be scary, but this is something that you have to consider if you're going to run a business. Because a company that tries to create its own large language model to train and deploy it and operate it from scratch, Gartner is predicting that by 2028, more than 50% of them will have just thrown their hands up and said, this is too hard, let's go do something else instead. Which I think there is some truth to that. This is a high barrier to entry, potentially high ROI if you can get there. But it is very difficult. And of the companies that are actually using large language models as their sort of centerpiece for their company, I thought this chart actually expressed something that I hadn't really thought about before. So left-hand side of the chart shows in green traditional companies. You got your YouTubes, you got your TikToks, you got your Robloxes. About when a user signs up, how many of them are still there at the end of the month, which ChatGPT, about 56%. That's pretty good. That's about half of the people that are using it are still using it after a month. But if you look at the future, if you look 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the road, those traditional companies, your Robloxes, your Snapchat, your TikToks, they have a substantial user base that stays on because there is something compelling enough to keep people on that platform. Whereas AI first companies, you'll see Runway actually has more monthly active users and daily active users a few months in than even ChatGPT does, which is crazy. But it does kind of make sense when you think about it. You see all these companies that get to 1 million daily active users within a few days of launching. But then after that point, the growth slows and it stagnates, and then it starts to recede, and then the next new thing comes on and everyone hops on that. And then that sort of starts to slow, starts to recede. So these daily active users and these monthly active users, that's where your revenue is going to come from. If they start to pull back after that first month, that's tough. And the other part, this one happened a few weeks ago when they had their dev conference. OpenAI announced that they were coming out with an OCR tool, which a lot of startups were like, oh no, that's not good. Because they had come out with their own OCR tool that worked on top of ChatGPT, and ChatGPT didn't have that capability. They added that functionality in. People liked it, and there were many startups that did that. Well, OpenAI took notice, and they said, no, this is stupid. This is an opportunity for us to get more revenue. They didn't necessarily copy one of these other companies, but they saw what they were doing. They saw that they were being successful with it, so they deployed this functionality, and overnight, dozens of startups, their valuation fell to zero. Because why would you go to another app to do OCR when you could just do it inside of the ChatGPT app itself? So there are some ways that you can use these large language models to create your own business, to be able to generate revenue. It has to be a unique enough use case, and it has to be compelling enough that OpenAI isn't going to come out with their own version of it, and that you have a large enough user base that is interested enough in using it. Which then we get to GitHub Copilot, which I've talked about on the periphery a few times. GitHub Copilot allows you to take a set of source code and then inline be able to generate more code based on the surrounding code as well as what you're wanting it to do. Now, we've had code completion tools for quite some time. We've had IntelliSense, that's been around since, I believe, Visual Basic 5. But those are very specifically trained and not really large language model, not really machine learning in the same way or the same extent. So it's been around for a while. But GitHub Copilot has blown up. There are so many people that are using it. And if you are going to use it, and if you are using it, something to be concerned about, you want to make sure that you have some sort of code scanning tool that is looking at your code, that it's producing, to make sure that there's not anything that's producing that has the obvious security vulnerability. The other aspect of it, and the one that I've still yet to see a really, really good answer for, is licensing. Because GitHub Copilot was trained off of a massive amount of open source code. It didn't always take into account the licensing of that code. So what if you ask it to be able to produce code that is under a GPL copyright? Well, you kind of run into some thorny issues there. Microsoft has said that they're working on it. It'll remain to be seen when exactly that comes out. But that is a consideration. If you are using this, make sure that you're protecting yourself and you're understanding both the security risks and you have proper mitigation in place, as well as the licensing risks and you have proper mitigation in place. In our experiments with it, it's been kind of hit or miss. So this is a live demonstration of explaining the Fibonacci sequence, which, if you can look at it, it's the Fibonacci sequence. Like, we all know what it is. And on the left-hand side where GitHub Copilot is running, it's doing a verbal interpretation of the code that it sees that is highlighted. The funny part is, if you were to, it's correct, by the way. It is absolutely correct what it is producing. If you were to ask a person to display the Fibonacci sequence, they would just say, it's the Fibonacci sequence. That's as simple as you can get. It is the Fibonacci sequence. You can go on any math textbook and find it. There's no reason to describe the code. So again, it's a really good peer if you want to have someone kind of bounce ideas back and forth off of, but it remains to be seen on how well it's explaining code. If it's a code base you don't know well, you can get pretty far off of it. But this is what the code completion looks like, to where it's looking at all the code above and below, and it's interpreting what the developer is doing to figure out what code it can produce based on that given input. Let's see if I can run it again. It gives the developer a couple different options, some things that it commonly knows people do. It's okay. I mean, the code that it produces isn't necessarily bad, and it's using awaits and it's keeping with the casing. Everything about it looks fairly straightforward. But always remember, you have to have someone that knows it to be able to push this code into production. The costs of using something like GitHub Copilot, it's not terribly expensive. I would say it's definitely cheaper than some other licensing that I've seen. What's interesting, though, in what I was reading about is allegedly GitHub Copilot actually loses Microsoft money. The business tier is $20 per user per month. There are some power users that are using it so much and causing so much burn rate that it actually costs Microsoft, I think, like $40. So they're actually losing $20 on the equation because the person's only paying $20 a month. Now, of course, I have to add the caveat. The CEO of GitHub says that this is fake news, but I mean, of course the CEO of GitHub is going to say it's fake news. It's in his own business interest to say that, GitHub Copilot is very successful and it's not actually losing them money. So GitHub Copilot, very well understood, very widely used, existing large language model. Now, what if you want to make your own? What if you have an amazing idea for some large language model that could revolutionize the world? You have to worry about many things, of which training and operational costs are probably going to be the front of mind, to where I wouldn't advise someone who sees this presentation and really wants to go out and change the world to just start from scratch. I'll talk about that one in a second. I would first recommend that you start with Hugging Face. Hugging Face is it's sort of the GitHub of large language models, is a good way to think about it. It is a community where people are able to post their pre-trained large language models for others to use. Of course, there's some licensing fees that you have to pay to the people that are using these things. I was able to play with it. It took a few minutes to get these things online, but it's not insurmountable. It's just another API. And you could even theoretically download them, run them within your own environment, to where it's probably going to be more effective, probably a lower TCO, if you're able to use a large language model that someone else has already trained and is working well to be able to do whatever your grand idea is. But let's say you're still not convinced. You're like, Zach, no, I really, really want to come up with my own large language model. There's a couple different platforms out there to do it. The most popular one that I've seen is LangChain, where when you truly want to get your own large language model up and running, you use something like LangChain to be able to describe what your large language model is doing. It helps with the training. The ML ops portion of it, you do kind of need to do that yourself. And it's an important thing that a lot of people don't consider when they get into this game. Very much like DevOps allowed us to automate the ability for someone to take some code, build it, and deploy it, and manage the infrastructure effectively. ML ops is a discipline that is gaining in popularity and is going to be something that we're going to be focusing on in the next year. For how do I automate the training? How do I automate the deployment? How do I automate the monitoring? And how do I take the things that my large language model is producing well, as well as the things that it's not producing well, and use those as input for my subsequent training sessions? ML ops is that sort of Venn diagram middle piece. It's that piece that's going to let us do all these things. It's non-trivial to get a lot of this stuff set up, and if you really want to do it, it can be expensive. When I was looking at a lot of the different cloud vendors, they all have sort of hosted options for how do I have my own instance of the OpenAI GPT 3.5 Turbo with 4K tokens. A lot of words there. Tokens, essentially, that's how much you can put into it and get out of it in one particular conversation. The more tokens you have, the more costly it's going to get. If you're just using this to play around with, it's probably going to cost you maybe like a few $100s a month. But if you're a very large company that's using this at scale, I mean, we're easily talking a run rate of a few, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars per month if you don't put some constraints and put some barriers around it. I would really recommend, if you're wanting to go down this route, to do the generative AI as a service offerings. Amazon has theirs as well. Amazon Bedrock is the one that people always use. And it's pretty good. They have, Anthropic, they've Claude, they have all the large ones, and it is costly. I will say that. So if you're going into this, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And that then leads into the conclusion. Generative AI as a whole is not a new field, but it's new in terms of its popularity. It's risen in the zeitgeist since probably about January, when ChatGPT really started to get noticed and people were able to see that this is a tool that could help me. And that's the part that I always have to remind people about. This is a tool. This is not something that is going to replace us. It's not the steam engine where, John Henry was trying to dig through the mountain. Like, this is a very specific tool. It has things that it's really good at, and it has things that it's not really good at. Just as my iPhone is good at a lot of different things. I don't want to use my iPhone as a hammer. It wouldn't work very well. Although my children have tried, it's not built to hammer things in. And so as we go into this journey together, we have to remember that our bias, our lens, our frame of reference really needs to be, how do we use this tool safely and appropriately to help do things faster than I could do myself without falling on my rake and letting it take over my life and producing some really bad results. You still always need an actual human being to be the arbiter, to be the one that decides, this is something good, this is something not good. That is the culmination of about 6-7 months of research that I did on the topic. Again, this is my very biased, very idiosyncratic take on how generative AI can help us, how we've seen companies use it currently, some of the bad parts about it. And as long as this is something that we're thinking about, this is long as something that we're able to use effectively, I do believe that this is something that will help us in the future. So with that, I yield the remainder of my time to the floor. Any questions or anything, drop them in the chat, use this QR code. Always looking to improve. Thank you all very much for your time. I'll stay on for a few minutes for any questions or anything. One question, is this going to be recorded? Absolutely. We're actually recording it 2 different ways to make sure that it gets recorded. Yeah, we can send out the link to the recording. It'll probably be a few weeks before we get it posted to YouTube. So good question. And if you're interested in having me present this at your company, I've done this before in terms of lunch and learns. Those are a little bit more dynamic than a recorded session, and kind of riff with the people that are on there. So, if you're interested in me doing it at your company, you just slide into my DMs. More than happy to do it pro bono. I don't charge for this. This is something I enjoy. All right. Well, with that, I give you all the rest of your day. I hope you have a fantastic time. Thank you for sticking with us, and thank you for having me today. Peace out.